All right, the 46th day of class, and we started class today with the geohistogram, the picture of our world history story, and we took a quick step back just to remind ourselves, what part of the story we've already learned about. We reminded ourselves of the four river valley civilizations: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, and ancient China. And there are the Hittites, even though the label's not there, who were able to manipulate metal, which is a game changer. The Hebrews giving us rule of law, and the first series of checks and balances, the rise of the Persians that were set to take over the world until they were stopped by the Greeks, the rise of Hellenistic culture with Alexander the Great here. We reminded ourselves of all the contributions that Greece has given the West, and many of these are still influenced. And then when Greece faded out, Rome picked up the torch of Western Civ, if you will, and Rome took what was Greek and made it better. For example, the architecture, adding the arch and the dome to pre-existing Greek architecture, or taking direct democracy and evolving it into a democratic republic. And then we reminded ourselves of the network of roads that connected Han China to Rome through Parthia and Kushan, and the hemispheric interactions that stemmed from the Silk Road. We reminded ourselves about Byzantium, that when Rome went away in 476 AD, the western portion of the Roman Empire, that they were occupied by what we call barbarian groups, and to the east Byzantium, and Byzantium adding civil law through Justinian's code. And we took a quick step back. So this part of the story, a lot of the story, we've covered in the first 45 days of class, but we have never talked about what's going on in the western part of our story. And we see some barbarian groups, the Celts, that are synonymous with Ireland, the Angles that are synonymous with England, Angles land England, Franks synonymous with France. And then we see this group right here, the Vikings. Now, for 300 years, the Vikings had significant dominance. And today's class and tomorrow's class, hopefully we're going to learn about the Vikings. So I'm going to be a very typical person in modern time. Go to Google and type in Vikings. What will come up? Let us see. Minnesota Vikings. Sad to report that they are first in the division. Hoping the Lions are in a couple of weeks. So let's see. We have a Shield Maiden. Where should I put myself? Forget it. I see the TV show Vikings on the History Channel. I see beards, tattoos, violence. There's blood in the water, tattoos. This guy has a face covered with blood, the Minnesota Vikings. That guy seems to have lost an eye. Axes, blood, shields, swords. Anything else? Hey, the Minnesota Viking cheerleaders. That's fantastic. The cast of Vikings on break. Any actual history? Artist rendering. Minnesota Vikings. Where are we going to get any history? Now, I want to take this one here. Locked on the Vikings. The Viking Horns. Now, the Viking horned helmet is a myth from Victorian fiction that depicted the Vikings as these savage, warmongering, scary people. But bear in mind, the Vikings beat up on the English for a few centuries, so it's not surprising that they had that bias. So after we did the geohistogram, we kind of went through our preconceptions of the Vikings. We did a 10 and 10 drill where I asked you to find 10 facts, and we found all sorts of things. First and foremost, the horned helmets. They're for Flavor Flav. They're not for the Vikings. But we learned how far they reached, from Constantinople in the Middle East to Nova Scotia in Canada. They arrived in North America centuries before Columbus did. Greenland, the story of Greenland, how the trick to saying, oh, it's beautiful here, it's so green and lush. Well, I'm going to name it Greenland just to trick people to go there. We talked about the weapons and the longboats and the axes and all that sort of thing. So, the Vikings are an interesting people. So we did that, and we came up with all sorts of different things. And then we went to a writing piece. Now, very academic writing here, the Vikings, grade level. And I asked you to highlight it. So I'm going to use my handy dandy, oops, not there. They're highlighting feature. Should I go straight yellow? Here, I'll be boring. Okay, so I wanted to take you through this reading. And again, when I have you target a reading, I want you to highlight little compared to too much. There's a couple people, the whole thing was highlighted, and I respectfully will ask you, what's the point of highlighting something if it's all yellow? It defeats the purpose. So let's go through here. The Vikings. The Vikings were Norse people from Scandinavia. Okay, Scandinavia. Where is that? That's Northern Europe, modern-day Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, who lived during the Viking Age, 8th century to the 12th century, so ballpark about 1800 AD to 1100 AD, give or take a few years. Since they spent much of their time traveling to raid, trade, and settle places throughout Europe, their legacy is widespread. A little opening. Maybe I will highlight this piece. In theory, I will highlight this piece. There you go. And that's a basic time frame. So even if you struggle, with stories, the who, what, where, why, and how is a pretty effective way to go about doing things. And stories and artifacts. Through popular movies and books, the Vikings are best known as barbaric seafaring raiders. As more archaeological evidence is excavated, however, historians are realizing that the Vikings were not as uncivilized as previously thought. It's been suggested that the original image of the Viking as aggressive and evil killers was most likely because records of them were written by the victims of their raids. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Frankish Annals, are two sources which have frequent records of Viking attacks. So in other words, the stereotypical Viking was created through the fiction of those the Vikings beat up on. Information about the Vikings is also provided through sagas, stories written by Norse ancestors. Now, I'm going to argue sagas are important. Sagas, stories, and the Norse Sagas are fantastic. The History Channel's Viking is based off the sagas, of Ragnar, written by Norse ancestors at the end of the Viking Age. We already know when that is. The most famous of these stories are the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, Eagle Saga, the saga of Eric the Red. These stories of conquest, which are referred to poems by skalds, court poets, during the Viking era, are often thought to be exaggerated in an attempt to preserve the Vikings' heroic status. While these accounts contribute to misleading and violent stereotype of the Vikings, sagas also provide an insight into Viking royalty of gods. So these things do provide an insight into Viking cultures, these sagas. Okay, much is known about the Norse people through archaeological evidence that's been excavated in modern times. This evidence has since shown there was more to Viking culture than violent raids. Artifacts such as farm implements, ironworking tools provide historians with insight into the daily life of the Norse people. The Gotland picture stones provide information on the changing Norse religious beliefs and culture. Coins from the Middle East and the Byzantine Empire, which were found in Sweden, indicate that the Norse Vikings were well-traveled traders. Okay, so they were traders. Now, we also said they were farmers. They weren't just all raiding all the time. Oops, I forgot that F. Oh, there you go. Remarkable Viking vessels, including the Longship and the Nar, also provided archaeologists with an understanding of how the Vikings were able to travel such great distances to Greenland, North America, and Constantinople. It's through a combination of these different types of physical evidence that the historians are able to uncover the background of the Viking legacy. So the Longship, these are not savages. If you can create a vessel that gets you across the Atlantic Ocean, over 1,000 years ago, you can do more than beat on people. Language. The Vikings frequently left their Scandinavian homelands to expand across a number of places in Western Europe. The Vikings traded with locals, raided coastal settlements, and explored new lands for colonization. As a result of this contact, a number of words across Europe have Scandinavian origins. So we have farmers, traders, a little more reiteration. Now, England. From the Vikings' first contact with Western Europe in 793, when they raided a monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of England, the Vikings continued to invade the British Isles. By 878, they managed to conquer all of England except for the area of Wessex. In 886, King Alfred made an agreement with the Vikings, which enabled them to live in the northeast third of England. That area became known as Danelaw. By 954, however, King Alfred's Anglo-Saxon successors had reclaimed England. It was not until 991 that the Danes reclaimed the English throne, but by this time they managed to hold on to it for 25 years. So we have the Viking influence in England. Oops, I didn't want that. Let's get rid of that. All right, there you go. So I was trying to just do England here. There you go. You dirty, rotten. There you go. Okay. This prolonged period of contact between the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, which lasted over several centuries, resulted in a large number of personal surnames, general words, and English place names being able to be traced to Scandinavian origins. Statistics show that in Yorkshire, over 60% of personal names in the Middle English had some Scandinavian influence. It is also thought that nearly 1,000 general words in the standard English today, such as give, anger, and husband, all owe their modern meanings to Viking settlers. Now, that's impressive. A lot of our words come from Viking origins. Examples of Scandinavian place names in England are also evident. They can be easily detected by suffixes. Grimsby, Thurnby are both names of places in England that use the suffix "by," which the Scandinavian word for farm or village. This is also the case for "bup, bup, 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 bup." So again, detail. Keeping what's important and discarding the detail. So I think we got the gist. Many different English words. In France, from the second decade of the 9th century, the Vikings raided France. In 911, however, tired of being invaded by the Vikings, Charles the Simple of West Francia made an agreement with the Viking leader Rollo. Rollo was granted the title Count of Rouen and received some land to the north of France. Rollo received these gifts in exchange for converting to Christianity. Okay, Vikings converting to Christianity, that's important, and agreeing to defend the shores from other Vikings. Since Rollo and the Vikings settled in Normandy, the influence of the Norse language can also be seen in France. So, in addition to English, there are a lot of Viking words in French. Society, last one. And again, oftentimes in reading, the key stuff is in the beginning and the end. Despite the Viking Age ending over 9 centuries ago, the legacy of Norse civilization is still visible today. Law and democracy are two ideals that were evident in Viking society. The Viking Althing was thought to be the first national assembly in Europe. That's important. I would argue the Althing had the power of parliament. Wow. Maybe they saved the best for last. I wasn't highlighting very much to the end, which meant that it could make laws. It also had the power of a court of law in which those found guilty. All right, that's something, court of law. All freemen took part in this national parliament. Despite the influence of the things declining as the powers of the kings grew, the Viking Althing set the way for a more democratic future. Hey, democracy, cool. Last part. Although women were not permitted to vote at the Althing, Norse women during the Viking era did enjoy a substantial degree of equality. That's cool. And refreshing, especially in the ancient world. Wasn't the best gig for women. Women ran the households and farms while their husbands were away. They could also own land and even divorce their husbands, which was a right not all women around the world had access to even centuries after the Viking Age ended. So I ended class by asking you in one paragraph, how would you summarize the Vikings? And some struggled, but again, if we're going to use a real basic, who, what, where, why, and what, and how. When, about 1800 to 1100. Who, the Vikings were initially farmers, who went on these raids, Viking raids to better themselves financially, where, they traveled to the British Isles and all the way to Greenland and Canada and Constantinople. They really were very well traveled. Why? To accrue more wealth. I can have you do this because I'm running long on time. So, hopefully you learned a little bit about the Vikings, and we'll continue on tomorrow. And thank you for watching. And I'm going to be glad to get out of this suit and tie. It was conferences tonight, and I am anxious to get out of this suit. Have a good night.